What's up, everybody? Brothers, sisters, psychonauts, and seekers of truth. It is Ananka, and welcome to my bazaar. Today, I am going to be reading the Japanese folktale, The Sparrow's Gifts. This version comes from the Pantheon Book of Japanese Tales by Royal Tyler. With all that being said, let our story begin. One warm spring day, an old woman was sitting at home, picking lice while a sparrow hopped about in her garden. Then a little boy threw a stone at the sparrow and broke its leg. As the sparrow fluttered helplessly along the ground, a crow came circling overhead. The poor thing, thought the old woman, the crow will get it. She picked the sparrow up, breathed on it, fed it, and put it in a little tub to keep it safe for the night. In the morning she fed the sparrow rice mixed with powdered copper to make it better. Her children and grandchildren made fun of her. "Silly old thing," they said. "Now you're babysitting sparrows?" She tended the sparrow for a month or two till it could hop again, and the sparrow was as happy as could be. If she went out, she made someone watch and feed it for her. The family kept teasing her unkindly. "What's all the fuss over a sparrow?" they grumbled. "It's such a dear little thing, you see," she answered. At last the sparrow seemed mended. "The crows'll never get you now," she said, taking it outside and lifting it on her open palm. "Let's see how you fly." The sparrow wobbled into the air and flew away. Having spent so long fussing over the sparrow, feeding it every day and putting it to bed, she missed it very much. Sometimes she talked about it and even wondered aloud whether it might come back. Mocking laughter was all she got in return. 3 weeks or so later, she heard a sparrow cheeping loudly nearby. Sure enough, it was her sparrow back again. "How lovely," she cried. "You haven't forgotten me." The sparrow cocked an eye at her, dropped something tiny from its beak, and flew off. It was a single gourd seed. She kept it because the sparrow had brought it to her. Her children jeered at her for being so happy about a present from a silly sparrow, but she had to plant the seed to see how it would grow. By fall the vine was huge and laden with far more fruit than any ordinary gourd vine. The old woman was very pleased. Though she gave gourds away to all the neighbors, there were always plenty more. The family who had mocked her now ate gourd for every meal. Finally, she shared out the gourds with the whole village, then hung 7 or 8 of the very biggest up inside to dry. Months later, when the gourds were ready, she began taking them down. How heavy they were. She cut the top off one to make a storage container, and on finding the gourd was full, she poured out a little of what was inside. It was white rice. After she had emptied what seemed like a whole gourdful into a bucket, the gourd was still as full as before. It was the sparrow she had to thank for this miracle. She was in rapture. The other gourds were just as full, and no matter how much she poured out, there was always more left than she knew what to do with. Her family grew rich. The neighbors could not believe their eyes and grew terribly jealous. "What makes you and her so different?" they complained to their old woman. "She's made them rich. We don't see you doing that for us." The woman went to her successful neighbor to find out how she had done it. "I gather it had something to do with the sparrow," she said, "but I don't quite understand. Please tell me the whole story." The first old woman admitted cautiously that it had all started with a seed a sparrow had brought her, but when pressed for details, she thought it would be petty of her not to tell it all. She explained how she had cared for the sparrow with the broken leg, and how she had planted the grateful sparrow's seed. The neighbors begged for just one seed from the bountiful vine, but the first old woman said no. She really could not give out the seeds. She offered rice from the gourds instead. The disappointed neighbor decided she would find her own injured sparrow and kept a sharp eye out for one, but in vain. Then she noticed the sparrows hopping about at her back door each morning, feeding on the rice grains scattered there, and she tried throwing stones at them. There were so many sparrows, and she threw so many stones that she finally managed to stun one. In glee, she broke its leg properly, then fed it food and medicine. As far as she could see, if one would make her rich, then more would make her richer, and she would get still more praise from her children than that neighbor woman had gotten from hers. So she scattered more rice and threw more stones at the sparrows until she had hit 3. That seemed enough. She put them in a tub and looked after them for a few months till they were better, then merrily took them outside and watched them flutter away. She was ever so pleased with herself. The sparrows, on the other hand, were very unhappy to have had their legs broken and have been shut up for months. In 10 days the 3 sparrows came back, and the woman peered eagerly at their beaks. Each dropped a gourd seed and flew off. There she chortled and planted the seeds. The vines grew faster than normal and became very large, but they did not bear many gourds, 7 or 8 per vine, no more. The woman looked on with a big grin. "You told me I was useless," she said to her children, "but I'm doing better than that woman next door." How the children hoped she was right. Since there were so few gourds, they gave none away, and did not even eat any themselves. They remembered, though, that the neighbor woman had shared her gourds with the whole village, and given them some as well. Perhaps they should offer some to other people, since they had 3 vines. The old woman agreed to give their nearest neighbors some gourds, and even sat down to a meal of gourd with her family. Everyone took a liberal portion, but the gourds turned out to be horribly bitter, and whoever ate any threw up. The neighbors they had been so generous to besieged the house, shouting, "What kind of stuff was that you gave us? Everyone who's even touched it is nearly dead from nausea and vomiting." But the old woman and her children, writhing on the floor and retching helplessly, were in no condition to answer. Fortunately, the victims recovered in a few days. What a disaster! The old woman decided she had been overeager and ought to have waited longer for the gourds to turn into rice. So she hung up the rest to dry. Months later, when she judged they were done, she got together enough containers to hold her harvest. Her toothless old mouth gaped wide in a shameless grin as she took down the gourds. And then she poured. Out came horseflies, wasps, centipedes, lizards, and snakes which battened onto her eyes, her ears, and every part of her body, and stung her without pity. She was so sure she was pouring out rice that she never felt a thing. She just kept muttering, "Just you wait, you little sparrows. I'll get some from each of you." Swarms of venomous snakes from the gourds bit the children and stung the old woman herself to death. Those 3 sparrows had enlisted the help of every nasty, creepy crawly in the world and put them into the gourds. Envy is something to avoid.